The photograph in his breast pocket showed the young woman he was engaged to marry. In 4 minutes she would never become his wife, and an American war cameraman standing 30 meters away would capture every second of it on film. Cologne, Germany. March 6, 1945. 12:20 in the afternoon.
The cathedral stood black against a gray sky, its twin spires scarred but unbroken after 4 years of Allied bombing. In the shadow of those spires, a young American lieutenant named Karl Kellner rolled his Sherman tank into the cathedral square. He was 26 years old. He had a fiancée waiting for him back home in Wisconsin.
He had, at that moment, less than 30 seconds to live. 200 meters ahead, hidden behind the rubble of a shattered hotel, a German Panther tank was already tracking him through its optics. The gunner squeezed. The 75mm shell crossed the square in a heartbeat. The Sherman shuddered. Then it exploded.
Inside the burning turret, 3 men were already dead. Karl Kellner clawed his way out through the commander's hatch, his uniform on fire, his skin blackening. He fell to the cobblestones. He tried to crawl. He did not make it.
20 meters away, a war correspondent named Sergeant Jim Bates pressed his eye to a Bell and Howell 35mm camera and kept filming. He filmed the smoke. He filmed the flames. He filmed a young American officer dying in the shadow of a German cathedral. He did not know it yet.
But he was recording the most famous tank battle footage of the Second World War. And he did not know something else. The tank that would arrive in the next 4 minutes to avenge Karl Kellner was not a Sherman. It was a machine the Germans did not know existed.
A machine that had been delayed for 3 years by a single American general who was already dead. This is the story of how that machine got there, and of the men who paid with their lives for every day it was late. To understand what happened at Cologne, we have to go back. Back to 1942.
Back to a Detroit factory floor, and a decision made by men in clean uniforms, thousands of miles from any battlefield. The M4 Sherman tank was born in that year. On paper, it was a triumph of American industry.
30 tons of welded steel, a 75mm gun, and an assembly line that could produce them faster than any other tank on Earth. By the end of the war, American factories would build more than 49,000 of them. The men who had to fight in them called them something different. They called them Ronsons.
Named after the cigarette lighter. Lights up first try, every time. The Sherman's armor was thin. Its gun was weak. Its gasoline engine caught fire when hit, and when it caught fire, the crew of 5 had roughly seconds to escape before the ammunition inside cooked off and turned the tank into a coffin. In Normandy. In the hedgerows.
In the Ardennes snow, American tankers learned a brutal mathematics. A Sherman firing at a German Tiger from the front at any distance beyond 100 meters could not penetrate its armor. A Tiger firing at a Sherman from 2,000 meters could destroy it in a single shot. The Germans knew this. The Americans knew this.
Everyone knew this, except, it seemed, one man. His name was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. In September of 1942, an American ordnance officer named Major General Glazion Barnes stood in a Washington conference room and unrolled the blueprints for a new tank. He called it the T-26. It weighed 41 tons.
It carried a 90mm gun, adapted from the anti-aircraft cannon that had already proven it could punch through German armor at any range. Barnes was not asking permission to invent a tank. He was asking permission to save American lives. Leslie McNair, the man responsible for how the American army would fight, listened. Then he refused. His reasoning was written into official army doctrine. Tanks, McNair believed, were not supposed to fight other tanks. That was the job of a separate class of vehicle called the tank destroyer. The Sherman was a breakthrough weapon, meant to exploit gaps in enemy lines and fight infantry.
If a Sherman crew ran into a Tiger, they were supposed to call for a tank destroyer to handle it. The Sherman crews in Normandy would later have a name for this doctrine. They called it the paperwork that got their friends killed. For 2 years, Barnes tried again. He submitted revised proposals in 1943.
He gathered combat data from North Africa. He collected reports from the Kasserine Pass, where American armor had been slaughtered by German panzers. He compiled charts, statistics, casualty lists. McNair refused, again and again.
Meanwhile, in a maintenance battalion in the 3rd Armored Division, a young lieutenant named Belton Cooper was learning what McNair's doctrine looked like in practice. Cooper was 27 years old, an engineer from Alabama. His job was to recover damaged Shermans, patch them together, and send them back into combat.
He was very good at his job. He had to be. By the end of the war in Europe, Cooper would document 648 Shermans destroyed in his division alone. 648 in one division, out of 16 American armored divisions in Europe. Cooper kept a private journal.
In it, he wrote about the smell of burned rubber and burned flesh. He wrote about pulling bodies out of turrets. He wrote about crews he had known personally, sent back into combat in tanks he had repaired, only to see them burn again a week later. In early 1944, Cooper did something remarkable for a junior officer.
He wrote a report. He documented the loss rates. He documented the causes. He documented with engineering precision why the Sherman could not survive against German heavy armor, and he sent it up the chain of command, all the way to the Supreme Allied Commander himself, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower read it. Eisenhower agreed.
And then Eisenhower's request for heavy tanks was blocked by Leslie McNair. Cooper wrote a single line in his diary that night. We already knew the Sherman was a coffin. Nobody would listen. Then history did something that history sometimes does.
Something that would sound like fiction if it were not documented in the official records of the United States Army. On July 25, 1944, in a Normandy field near the village of St. Lo, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair stood in a forward observation position to watch Operation Cobra.
It was the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead, the largest carpet bombing operation of the war. 1,500 American heavy bombers roaring overhead in waves would drop their payloads on the German defensive lines just a few kilometers away. The wind shifted. The bomb line drifted. American bombs fell on American positions. Leslie McNair was killed instantly. He was the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater. He was buried in secret at first, so the Germans would not learn of his death. His son, Colonel Douglas McNair, would be killed less than 2 weeks later on Guam.
And 3 weeks after Leslie McNair's death, the T-26 program was approved for full production. 3 weeks, 2 years of delay, 648 Shermans in one division, thousands of young men buried in French fields, and 3 weeks after the man who had blocked the tank was killed by his own Air Force, the tank was finally built.
Belton Cooper would live until 2007. He wrote a book about all of it. He called it Death Traps. He never forgave McNair. He never pretended to. Meanwhile, in a small mining town called Laheyton, Pennsylvania, a young man named Clarence Smoyer was learning to shoot. Smoyer was 22 years old in 1945. Quiet.
Soft-spoken, the son of a coal miner. He wore glasses, and he was slightly nearsighted, which the Army noted but did not consider disqualifying. He had been drafted in 1942. He had trained as a Sherman gunner. He had crossed the English Channel 3 weeks after D-Day.
By January of 1945, Clarence Smoyer had buried 4 friends. Their tanks had burned. He had helped identify the remains. He was assigned to the 3rd Armored Division, the Spearhead Division, Belton Cooper's division. His tank commander was a 26-year-old sergeant from Pennsylvania named Bob Early. Early was calm.
Early did not raise his voice. Early had a way of looking at a battlefield and seeing it whole, the way a chess player sees a board. His men trusted him with their lives, which is what he was asking them to trust him with. In late January of 1945, Smoyer and Early were pulled out of the line. They were told nothing.
They were driven to a rear area near the Belgian border,
where a row of tarpaulins covered something the size of tanks, but somehow larger. The tarps came off. What Smoyer saw underneath, he would later describe as the first moment in 3 years of war that he felt something other than dread. The tank was 41 tons.
Low, angular, cast in a single massive piece of steel. Its hull sloped at aggressive angles. Its turret was enormous, and its gun. The gun was longer than anything Smoyer had ever seen on an American tank. Longer than a Tiger's, longer than a Panther's, 90 millimeters, adapted from the anti-aircraft cannon.
The crews were told nothing about how it had gotten there. They were not told about Glazan Barnes. They were not told about Belton Cooper's report. They were not told about Leslie McNair, or the accidental bombing at Saint-Lô, or the 2 years of delay that had killed thousands of men. They were told only its name. M26 Pershing.
Named for the general, who had led American forces in the First World War. They were told it would be shipped to Europe under secrecy. They were told the Germans would not know it existed. They were told there would be exactly 20 of them in the entire European theater. 20 tanks against a Panzerwaffe that still fielded thousands.
The operation had a code name. It was called Zebra Mission. On January 15, 1945, in the port of New York, under cover of darkness, the first 20 M26 Pershings were loaded onto ships bound for Antwerp. The manifest listed them as heavy maintenance equipment. 11 days later, they arrived in Europe.
6 weeks after that, one of them would roll into a burning square in front of the Cologne Cathedral, and a 22-year-old coal miner's son from Pennsylvania would put his eye to a gun sight and squeeze. But before Cologne, before the film that made history, before the world learned the name Clarence Smoyer,
There was a Pershing that never fired a shot, a crew that died in the first minute of the first battle, and a village called Elsdorf, where the legend of the American supertank almost died before it was born. Elsdorf, Germany, February 26, 1945. 6:30 in the morning.
The sky over the Rhineland was the color of wet ash. A cold rain had fallen through the night, and the cobblestone streets of the small farming village were slick and dark. Elsdorf had been fought over for 3 days. Most of its 2,000 civilians had fled west. The ones who remained were hiding in cellars, listening.
They heard the engines before they saw anything. A deep, throaty rumble that did not sound like a Sherman. Sergeant Nick Mashlanik was 28 years old, a steel worker from Pennsylvania before the war. He commanded the Pershing tank that his crew had named Fireball, painted in white letters on the side of the turret.
He had trained on it for 3 months at Fort Knox. He had crossed the Atlantic with it in the hold of a merchant ship. He had waited 3 weeks for the order to take it into combat. The order had come at dawn. Fireball rolled into Elsdorf at the head of a small column. Behind it were 2 Shermans and a platoon of infantry riding on the hulls.
The mission was simple: push through the town, secure the eastern edge, wait for reinforcements. Mashlanik was standing in the commander's cupola, head out scanning the rooftops. The rain had stopped. The mist was lifting. He could see maybe 200 meters down the main street. He did not see the Tiger.
The German tank was hidden behind the wall of a bombed-out farmhouse, no more than 100 meters from the intersection Fireball was approaching. Its commander was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had killed dozens of Soviet tanks and who had been transferred west 3 months earlier.
His gunner already had the crosshairs on the front of the Pershing. He had been tracking it since the moment it came into view. The Tiger's 88mm gun fired. At 100 meters, the shell traveled the distance in less than 1/10 of a second. It struck the Pershing's gun mantlet.
The mantlet was one of the thickest pieces of armor on the tank, but it was also the piece directly in front of 2 men, the gunner and the loader. The shell did not fully penetrate, but it did not need to. The impact sent a shockwave of steel fragments and molten metal through the interior of the turret.
The gunner and the loader were killed instantly. Both were in their early 20s. They would be recorded in the Ordnance Department's casualty report as the first 2 American tankers to die inside an M26 Pershing. Mashlanik was thrown backward by the blast. His radio was screaming. Fireball was still moving.
He grabbed the driver's shoulder and shouted at him to stop, to reverse, to get out of the killing zone. The driver, half deaf from the blast, obeyed. Mashlanik climbed down into the turret. He saw what had happened to his gunner. He saw what had happened to his loader. He did not have time to feel it yet. He gave the order to abandon the tank.
Fireball was recovered later that day. She had not fired a single shot. The first Pershing to see combat in the Second World War had been destroyed by a Tiger. The 2 crewmen who died were the first American tankers to be killed inside a machine that was supposed to save them. If the story had ended there, the Pershing would be a footnote.
A failed experiment. A cautionary tale about promising too much from a weapon that arrived too late. But the story did not end there. It began there. Because 24 hours later, on the outskirts of the same town, another Pershing was moving into position. Its name was Eagle 7. Its commander was Sergeant Bob Early.
And its gunner was Corporal Clarence Smoyer. They had been told about Fireball. They had been told about the 2 dead crewmen. They had been told quietly that the Tiger that killed them was still somewhere in the sector. Smoyer, 22 years old, said nothing when he heard the news. He climbed into the gunner's seat.
He put his eye to the sight. He waited. It was late afternoon on February 27th. The light was already fading. Early had positioned Eagle 7 at the corner of a barn, with a clear field of fire down a farm lane that ran toward a wooded area. Intelligence said the Tiger was somewhere in those woods. Then Smoyer saw movement. Not a Tiger.
A Panzer IV, the workhorse of the German army, slower and lighter than a Tiger but still a killer. It rolled out of a hedgerow 600 meters away, exposing its flank. Smoyer put the crosshairs on it. Early gave the order. The 90mm gun fired. The Panzer IV exploded. Not disabled. Not damaged. Exploded.
The entire vehicle lifted off the ground and came down as burning wreckage. A second Panzer IV appeared behind it. Smoyer traversed. He fired again. The second tank burst into flames, and then the Tiger came out of the woods. It was a Tiger 1, the same model that had killed Fireball.
The same model that had haunted Sherman crews from Sicily to the Ardennes. It was moving cautiously, its long 88mm gun swinging left and right, searching for the American who had just killed 2 of its escorts. Smoyer saw it first. The Tiger was moving at an angle, not head-on.
Its side was exposed, though barely, at a distance of roughly 100 meters. Smoyer had one clean shot at the flank armor. He had been trained his entire life for this moment, though he had not known it at the time. He fired. The 90mm shell struck the side of the Tiger's hull. It punched through the armor.
It entered the crew compartment, and it detonated. The Tiger did not burn immediately. It simply stopped. The turret hatch did not open. Nothing moved inside. Clarence Smoyer had done what no American tank crew had done before in the way the Pershing was designed to do it. He had killed a Tiger in a straight, one-on-one engagement, and he had done it in less than a minute. There would be other Pershing combat kills before the war ended. There would be other American tank crews who claimed hits on Tigers.
But when the records were combed through after the war, when historians and ordnance officers pieced together the after-action reports and cross-referenced them with German records, one hard fact would remain.
The engagement at Elsdorf on February 27, 1945 was the only fully verified case of an M26 Pershing destroying a Tiger 1 in combat during the entire Second World War. 1 tank, 1 crew, 1 shot.
Every legend that would follow, every documentary, every magazine article that spoke of the Pershing as the American tank that hunted tigers would trace back to that single moment on that single farm lane in the fading light of a February afternoon. Bob Early did not celebrate. Clarence Smoyer did not smile. They radioed in the kill.
They watched the Tiger for another 20 minutes, waiting for anyone to crawl out. Nobody did. They moved on. What Smoyer and Early did not know, and what nobody in the American Army knew that night, was that the Germans had no idea what had just happened to them. The Wehrmacht had one of the best intelligence services of the war.
Its analysts had tracked every major Allied weapons program. They knew about the Sherman variants. They knew about the 76mm upgrade. They knew about the British Firefly with its 17-pounder gun. They did not know about the Pershing.
By the first week of March 1945, German intelligence reports were beginning to trickle in about a new American tank. The descriptions were vague. Longer gun than a Sherman, heavier armor, lower profile. The reports came from surviving crewmen of destroyed Panthers and Panzer IVs.
None of them had gotten close enough to identify it before dying. The German analysts, unable to imagine that America had built an entirely new heavy tank, gave it the only name that made sense to them. They called it the Long Gun Sherman. They believed it was a variant, a field modification, a one-off. They did not issue warnings.
They did not update their recognition manuals. They did not change their tactics. This mistake would kill dozens of them in the next 30 days. Meanwhile, deep in the Rhineland, the 3rd Armored Division was preparing for the largest urban assault the Americans had attempted since the war began. The target was Cologne,
a city of 750,000 people. The 4th largest city in Germany, a symbol. Its cathedral, the Kölner Dom, had stood for 600 years. It was one of the most recognizable buildings in Europe. American bombing had damaged the city around it, reducing whole neighborhoods to rubble. But the cathedral itself still stood.
Its twin spires rose above the ruins like something that refused to die. The 3rd Armored Division's commander was a 45-year-old Major General named Maurice Rose. Rose was the son of a Denver rabbi. He was the highest-ranking Jewish officer in the United States Army.
He led from the front, always in a jeep at the head of his division, sometimes even ahead of the reconnaissance elements. His men had a name for him. They called him the General who does not stop. Rose did not stop for Cologne. He gave the order to attack on the morning of March 5th, 1945.
His division would enter the city from the west, split into 3 combat commands, and drive toward the cathedral. Whoever reached the cathedral first would raise the American flag over one of the most sacred buildings in Germany. Attached to one of those combat commands was a small figure with a large camera. His name was Sergeant Jim Bates.
He was in his early 30s, Signal Corps. His job was to film the battle. Bates carried a Bell and Howell IEMO, a 35mm motion picture camera that weighed almost 7 pounds. He had already filmed engagements in Normandy and the Bulge. He was tired.
He was also, though he would never say it aloud, one of the finest combat cameramen of the war. On March 6th, Bates would be in the Cathedral Square, alone, on foot, with no cover. He would keep filming until his film ran out. What he captured that day would be studied for the next 80 years.
The morning of March 6th, 1945, broke gray and cold. American tanks moved through streets choked with rubble. Civilians, the ones who had stayed, watched from cellar windows. There was almost no infantry resistance. The German army was collapsing.
What remained in Cologne was a mixed force of Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth, and a handful of tanks from an ad hoc training unit called the Panzer Ausbildungsverband Bayern. One of those tanks was a Panther Ausf A. Its commander was named Wilhelm Bartelborth. His crew had 5 men, most of them under 25 years old.
They had been ordered to hold the cathedral square for as long as possible. They positioned the Panther behind the ruins of a hotel called the Excelsior. From that position, they had a clear field of fire across the open plaza to the west. Anything that entered the square would be exposed.
The Panther's 75mm gun could kill any Sherman in one shot. They waited. At 12:15 in the afternoon, they heard engines, American engines. A Sherman rolled into the square from the west. Its designation was F-13.
Its commander was First Lieutenant Carl Kellner, 26 years old, from Pennsylvania.
Kellner had a fiancée waiting for him back home. He carried her photograph in his breast pocket. He had shown it to his crew that morning. The Panther gunner squeezed his trigger. The 75mm shell crossed the square. It struck F-13 just below the turret ring.
The Sherman shuddered, stopped, and began to burn from the inside out. 3 men were killed in the first second. Corporal Curtis Vinson, driver from Illinois. Private First Class John DeRiggi, loader, 22, from Pennsylvania. Corporal Louis Kaczmarek, gunner, from Michigan. Carl Kellner was still alive. He was on fire.
He climbed out of the commander's hatch. He fell onto the hull. He rolled off, hit the cobblestones, and tried to crawl away from the burning tank. Jim Bates was 30 meters away, behind a doorway. He was already filming. The camera did not shake. Bates had done this before. He held the frame steady on the burning tank.
He held it as Kellner crawled. He held it as another German shell struck F-13 and finished her. He held it as Carl Kellner stopped moving. The footage would be watched by tens of millions of people over the next 80 years. It would be studied in film schools. It would be shown in classrooms.
The man who died in that footage would remain, for most of those viewers, an anonymous American soldier. His name was Carl Kellner. His wife, Kay, would receive the telegram in Pennsylvania 2 weeks later. She would live the rest of her life having met her husband, most vividly, in 10 seconds of film that showed him dying.
Back at the American command post, half a mile away, the radio crackled with the news. F-13 was destroyed. A German tank was still active in the Cathedral Square. Send Eagle 7. Bob Early heard the order. He turned to Clarence Smoyer. Are you ready? Smoyer nodded. He did not speak. He put his eye back to the gun sight.
Eagle 7's engine roared, and the Pershing moved forward through the ruins of Cologne, toward the burning Sherman, toward the hidden Panther, toward the moment that Jim Bates was already waiting to film. Smoyer made a decision as they approached. It was a decision that violated his training.
His loader was preparing an armor-piercing round, the standard ammunition for engaging enemy tanks. Smoyer stopped him. High explosive. The loader hesitated. High explosive rounds were for infantry and buildings, not for Panthers. Smoyer knew this. He also knew something else. The high explosive round was slower.
It could not penetrate the Panther's thickest armor from far away. But at 90 meters, it did not need to. It only needed to hit the joint between the turret and the hull and detonate, and it would not punch through and keep going. Into the apartment buildings behind the Panther, into whatever civilians might still be huddled in those cellars.
High explosive, Smoyer said again. The loader slammed the round home. Eagle 7 rolled around the corner of the Kaisering Boulevard and into the Cathedral Square. Smoyer saw the Panther. The Panther saw Eagle 7. The distance between them was 90 meters. Smoyer fired first.
The high explosive round struck the Panther's mantlet and detonated. The Panther shook. Smoyer's loader was already ramming another round. Smoyer fired again and again. 3 rounds in less than 10 seconds. The Panther burst into flames. 2 crewmen died in the tank. Wilhelm Bartelborth's gunner, his loader, both under 22 years old.
3 men escaped. One of them was a young radio operator named Rolf Militzer. He would live. He would remember. In 68 years, he would look into the eyes of the man who fired those 3 shots, and he would understand something that Clarence Smoyer had spent his whole life trying to forget. But that was still 68 years away.
At the moment Eagle 7's third shell struck the Panther, another vehicle was moving through the intersection at the corner of the square. It was a small, dark sedan, an Opel P4. Inside were 2 people. A man named Michael Delling was driving. Beside him sat 26-year-old Katharina Esser, who worked at his store.
They had been trying to leave the city for days. They had chosen this afternoon to make their escape. They believed the fighting was moving away from the cathedral. They believed they could slip through. They drove straight into the middle of it. Nobody knows for certain which side fired the shots that hit the Opal. It may have been the Panther.
It may have been Eagle 7's machine gun. It may have been Ricochet's. What is known is that the car was hit multiple times, that it swerved, and that it stopped at the edge of the square as its engine died. Michael was wounded. He climbed out. He tried to pull Katharina from the passenger side. She was already gone. Jim Bates was still filming.
He filmed the car. He filmed Michael. He filmed, in a wide shot that lasted less than 4 seconds, the body of a young woman in a dark coat slumped in the passenger seat of an Opel P4 in the shadow of the Cologne Cathedral. That footage was cut before it was released to the American public.
The editors at Universal Newsreel who prepared the film for domestic viewing removed the shot of the dying woman. They removed the shot of the Opel. They kept the tanks. They kept the burning Sherman. They kept the heroic 90mm gun of Eagle 7, firing 3 times in 10 seconds. They cut Katharina Esser out of the war.
She would remain cut out for 68 years. Her name would not be spoken by any American historian. Her death would not be recorded in any English-language account of the battle. She would be, in the record of the Second World War, invisible. Clarence Smoyer would not learn her name until 2013.
When he did, he would sit down. He would put his hands over his face and he would cry. Cologne fell that afternoon. The American flag was raised over the cathedral square before nightfall. By March 7, 1945, the city belonged to the 3rd Armored Division.
Jim Bates packed his camera into its wooden case and boarded a jeep heading west. He did not know that the film in his hands would become one of the most viewed pieces of combat footage in history. He only knew that he was tired and that he wanted to sleep. Eagle 7 rolled out of the city with the rest of the division.
Clarence Smoyer sat in the gunner's seat. He did not speak for most of the day. Bob Early, watching him from the commander's cupola, said nothing either. There was nothing to say.
24 days later, on March 30th, 1945, in a wooded crossroads near the German town of Paderborn, a jeep carrying Major General Maurice Rose was ambushed by a German tank column. Rose was ordered to surrender. As he raised his hands to unbuckle his sidearm, a young German soldier, panicked in the dark, opened fire.
Maurice Rose was killed by a burst of machine pistol fire at close range. He fell face down in the dirt of a country road, 20 kilometers from the Rhine. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the European theater.
The son of a Denver rabbi, the man who had led his division across France, Belgium, and Germany without once sleeping behind the front lines, died in the mud on a nameless road in a country whose ideology had marked him for death from birth. Clarence Smoyer heard the news over the tank radio. He did not remember what he said. He remembered only that Bob Early, calm and quiet as always, closed his eyes for a long moment, and then opened them, and then gave the order to keep moving. There was still a war to finish. By the 3rd week of April, the 3rd Armored Division had reached the outskirts of a city called Dessau. The German army was in collapse.
Whole units were surrendering. Others were fighting with the ferocity of men who knew they had nothing left to lose. Attached to the division was a single tank that was unlike anything else in the American arsenal. It was a Pershing, but it was not an ordinary Pershing.
It had been fitted with a new experimental gun, longer and more powerful than the standard 90mm. The gun barrel was so heavy that the crew had welded steel plates to the front of the turret as counterweights. The tank had been given a designation, T-26E4. Its crew called it the Super Pershing. Only one of them ever saw combat.
Its commander was a young sergeant named John Irwin, 22 years old, from Cleveland. He would later write a memoir about the war. In it, he described what happened on April 21, 1945, on the road into Dessau. Irwin's tank was moving along an elevated causeway when he spotted a German tank on a hill about a mile away.
It was silhouetted against the sky. Even at that distance, Irwin could see that it was enormous, longer than a panther, taller than a tiger one. He believed, at the moment he saw it, that he was looking at a Tiger II, a King Tiger, the largest and most heavily armored tank the Germans ever put into combat.
Some historians, working from post-war records, have questioned whether it was truly a Tiger II, or perhaps a Jagdtiger tank destroyer, or even a Panther. The German records from Dessau are incomplete. Many were destroyed in the final weeks of the war. What is not disputed is what Irwin did next. He ordered his gunner to fire.
The Super Pershing's massive gun spoke once. The shell traveled the distance in less than 3 seconds. It struck the German tank at an angle that carried it through the belly armor, into the fighting compartment, and out through the engine deck. The German tank exploded.
It was, if the identification stands, the only Pershing kill of a Tiger II in the entire war. One tank, one shot, one more entry in a ledger that already contained only a handful of pages. By the end of April, the Pershing story was, for all practical purposes, over. Germany would surrender on May 8, 1945.
The war in Europe was done. When ordnance officers sat down after the war to tally the results, the numbers were sobering. 310 Pershings had reached Europe before VE Day. Approximately 20 of them had seen actual combat. The confirmed kills against German heavy armor amounted to 1 Tiger I at Elsdorf,
1 probable Tiger II at Dessau, a handful of Panthers, several Panzer IVs. That was it. For the next 80 years, the American public would be told a different story. They would be told that the Pershing had struck fear into the heart of the Panzerwaffe, that German tank crews had trembled at the sight of its 90mm gun,
that the appearance of the Pershing on the battlefield had broken the will of the German army and hastened the end of the war. Most of that story was invented. When American intelligence officers interrogated German tank crews after the surrender, they discovered something they had not expected.
The majority of Panzer crewmen had never heard of the Pershing. They did not know it existed. They had not encountered it on the battlefield. They had not been briefed on it. They had not feared it. They had surrendered because they were out of fuel. They had surrendered because they were out of ammunition.
They had surrendered because their country had run out of everything, including hope. The Pershing had not broken the Panzerwaffe. Attrition had. Air power had. The Red Army pouring in from the east had.
The Sherman, the ordinary, hated, burning Sherman, with its thin armor and its weak gun, had done more to defeat the German army than the Pershing ever did. Not because it was better. Because there were 49,000 of them, and there were only 20 Pershings that ever fired a shot.
The legend of the American super tank was built after the war. It was built by the Ordnance Department, which needed to justify the enormous cost of post-war heavy tank development. It was built by veterans who wanted to believe their sacrifices had produced a weapon that mattered.
It was built by writers who preferred a clean narrative to a complicated truth. The truth was messier. The truth was that the Pershing had arrived too late to save Belton Cooper's 648 burned Shermans. Too late to save Karl Kellner in the Cathedral Square. Too late to save the crewmen of Fireball.
Too late, most of all, to save the 2 years that Leslie McNair had cost the United States Army with a single word. No. Clarence Smoyer came home in the fall of 1945. He did not talk about the war. He got a job. He married a woman named Melba. He raised children.
He worked at a cement plant in Allentown, Pennsylvania. For the next 38 years, he wore a suit to church on Sundays. He was, by every outward measure, an ordinary American man of his generation. Inside, he was not ordinary. He carried Karl Kellner with him. He carried the burning Sherman. He carried the 5 men in the Panther.
And, though he did not yet know her name, he carried the young woman in the dark coat in the passenger seat of an Opel P4. He carried them for 68 years. In 2013, an American journalist and historian named Adam Makos came to see him. Makos was writing a book about the 3rd Armored Division.
He had already interviewed Bob Early before Early's death. He had already tracked down surviving German veterans of the battle at Cologne. He wanted to know if Smoyer would come with him to Germany. Smoyer was 90 years old. He said yes. They flew to Cologne together in the summer of 2013.
Makos had arranged something Smoyer did not know about in advance. Waiting for them at a small cafe near the cathedral was a very old man. His name was Gustav Schaefer. He had been 18 years old in 1945, a gunner in a Panzer IV, in the same battle in which Eagle 7 had fought. Smoyer sat down across from him.
The two men looked at each other. Schaefer spoke first, through an interpreter. He said, "I am glad you are here." Smoyer nodded. He said, "So am I." They talked for hours. They spoke of the fear. They spoke of the noise. They spoke of the friends they had lost. They did not speak of politics or ideology.
They spoke of what young men speak of when they finally meet, after a lifetime, the other young men who tried to kill them. Later that week, Makos brought a second man to meet Smoyer. His name was Rolf Militzer. He had been the radio operator in the Panther that Eagle 7 had destroyed in the Cathedral Square on March 6, 1945.
He was one of the 3 survivors. Militzer was in his late 80s. He walked with a cane. When he saw Smoyer, he stopped. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "You are the man who shot my tank." Smoyer said, "Yes." Militzer said, "Thank you for not killing all of us." The 2 men embraced. Neither of them spoke for a while.
There was nothing more to say. But there was one more thing Makos had prepared. One more thing that would take Clarence Smoyer to the ground he had never expected to visit. They drove out of central Cologne to a quiet residential cemetery. Makos had spent months searching German civil records. He had found the name. He had found the grave.
He had found her. Katharina Esser was buried in a modest plot. A simple stone, her name, the dates, 1919 to 1945. 26 years old, Smoyer stood at the foot of the grave. Makos had brought a small bouquet of white roses. He handed them to Smoyer. Smoyer laid them at the base of the stone. He said one thing, just one.
"I did not know you were there." He stood for a long time. He was 90 years old. He had waited 68 years to say those words to a woman who could not hear them. His shoulders were shaking. Makos, standing behind him, did not speak. There was nothing to say. Clarence Smoyer flew home from Germany a week later. He lived another 9 years.
In 2019, 74 years after the war ended, the United States Army awarded him the Bronze Star for his actions at Cologne. He accepted the medal quietly. He did not make a speech. He died on December 20th, 2022. He was 99 years old.
He had outlived every other member of Eagle 7's crew. He had outlived Bob Early. He had outlived Nick Michlonick. He had outlived Belton Cooper. He had outlived Gustav Schaefer and Rolf Militzer, and every German who had ever pointed a gun at him.
In the years before his death, he was asked many times what he wanted people to remember about the war. He gave different answers to different interviewers. But one answer, given late in his life to a small Pennsylvania newspaper, came closest to the truth. He said, "We were not heroes. We were boys who were given a bigger gun."
And the gun came too late to save our friends. But it came in time to make us carry them the rest of our lives. 310 Pershings crossed the Atlantic. 20 of them fought. 1 Tiger fell to a Pershing gun in a farm lane in Elsdorf. 1 Panther fell in a square in front of the Cologne Cathedral. Karl Kellner fell there too.
So did a young woman who had chosen the wrong afternoon to try to escape her city. The Pershing did not win the war. It did not break the Panzerwaffe. It did not save the 648 Shermans that Belton Cooper had watched burn. What it did was this: it arrived. In the last 6 weeks of a 6-year war, it arrived.
And in the arriving, it became something that mattered more than steel or ammunition or 90 millimeters of high-velocity American engineering. It became a mirror.
A mirror that showed, to the men who lived through it, and to the men who tell it now, the true price of every decision made in a clean office by a man who will never sit in the gunner's seat. Leslie McNair paid that price with his life in a bombed field in Normandy.
Belton Cooper paid it with a lifetime of nightmares and a book that few would read. Carl Kellner paid it in 10 seconds of film, dying in the shadow of a cathedral, in front of a wife he would never come home to. Katharina Esser paid it in a car she never got to drive out of the city.
And Clarence Smoyer paid it for 68 more years, in a small house in Pennsylvania, until he stood in a German cemetery with white roses in his hands, and finally for the first time said the words out loud. I did not know you were there. That is the story of the American Pershing.
That is the story of the 90mm gun that could kill tigers. That is the story the newsreels never told. That is the true one.